Most people believe they are failing in their studies due to a lack of discipline, focus, or motivation. But almost no one considers the most dangerous possibility of all. Maybe you never learned how to study correctly. And until that changes, any routine you build will end up crumbling. Studying incorrectly is silent. You sit down, spend hours reading, watching lectures, making beautiful notes, and yet you feel like you're not making progress. The content doesn't stick, confidence doesn't grow, and frustration accumulates. Gradually, the brain begins to associate studying with futile effort. And when that happens, discipline starts to fail. The problem is not you. The problem is the method. Or rather, its absence. Most people were never taught how the brain actually learns. They were taught to consume information, not to transform it into solid knowledge. When you study incorrectly, your brain works against you. It gets tired more quickly, gets easily distracted, and forgets almost everything in a short time. This creates a dangerous cycle. The more you try, the less result you see. And the less result you see, the less desire you have to continue. Before talking about advanced techniques, routines, or productivity, there is something essential that needs to be corrected. The foundation. Because no routine survives when studying is poorly structured. In this video, you will learn how to study for real. Not to appear productive, but to learn in a real, efficient, and sustainable way. Before your routine completely falls apart. If you've ever felt like you study a lot but learn little, subscribe to the channel now. Here, the focus is on learning how to study correctly, using cognitive science, learning psychology, and methods that work in the real world. Before learning any study technique, it is necessary to understand why most routines break so quickly. The problem is not the lack of effort, but the way the brain is exposed to learning. When you study without a clear method, the brain enters cognitive survival mode. It consumes energy, but does not build structure. The biggest trap is confusing time with learning. Many people believe that studying more hours automatically yields results. But the brain doesn't learn by duration. He learns through active processing. If there is no real cognitive effort, the information passes through the mind and disappears. Another common mistake is trying to study everything in the same way. Read, underline, watch classes at normal speed. These methods give a sense of productivity, but demand little from the brain. And what requires little, the brain does not prioritize in memory. When this repeats for days or weeks, something dangerous happens. The brain begins to associate studying with fatigue without reward. Motivation drops, discipline weakens, and the routine starts to fail. Not because you are weak, but because the brain doesn't see value in the process. Studying correctly means aligning the method with the way the brain learns. Create intelligent effort, retrieve information, test understanding, and organize knowledge logically. Without this, any routine becomes just an empty ritual. Before talking about schedules, goals, or productivity, it is necessary to correct this point. Because a strong routine built on incorrect study won't withstand pressure. The first fundamental principle for studying correctly is to understand that learning is not receiving information, it is reconstructing it within your own mind. The brain does not learn when you simply read or listen. It learns when it needs to actively work to make sense of what has been presented. When you study passively, the brain goes into economy mode. It recognizes the content, but does not create deep connections. That's why the false sense of understanding arises. It seems to make sense at that moment, but it disappears days later. Studying correctly begins when you force your brain to retrieve information without assistance. Close the material and try to explain it in your own words. Answer questions without consulting. Solve exercises without looking at the example. This effort activates brain areas linked to long-term memory. At first, this is uncomfortable. You notice gaps, confusion, difficulty. But this discomfort is exactly the sign that the brain is learning. When something seems too easy, it is usually not being consolidated. Another important point is to abandon the idea of studying to understand everything on the first try. The brain learns in layers. First comes confusion, then organization, and only then clarity. Those who accept this process learn faster in the long run. This principle completely changes the way of studying. You stop seeking comfort and start seeking real progress. And this, gradually, rebuilds confidence in one's own learning. The second essential principle for studying correctly is to stop trying to learn everything at once. The brain was not made to absorb large volumes of information in one go. When you force it, it becomes saturated and starts discarding content to protect itself. Many routines break because the person tries to study as if they were accumulating data. Long sessions, many topics, little pause. At first, it seems productive, but the retention is minimal. Days later, almost everything is lost. This leads to rework and frustration. Studying correctly means fragmenting the learning. Divide the content into small, well-defined parts that are interconnected. Each session should have a clear objective. A concept, a central idea, a specific problem. This reduces cognitive load and increases depth. Another important point is spacing out the study. The brain learns better when information reappears over time. Reviewing on different days, in different contexts, forces the brain to reconstruct knowledge. This repeated effort strengthens long-term memory. This principle also avoids the false sense of mastery. When you review something days later and can still explain it, you know you have truly learned it. When you can't, you identify exactly where you need to reinforce. With this adjustment, studying stops being exhaustive and becomes efficient. Fewer hours, more retention. Less anxiety, more clarity. One of the most common mistakes that makes people study incorrectly for years is confusing recognition with learning. When you read content and think "I've seen this before," the brain generates a sense of familiarity. This feeling is comfortable, but extremely misleading. Recognizing is not the same as knowing. The brain is very good at recognizing visual patterns and familiar phrases. That's why rereading notes, underlining texts, and watching classes repeatedly create the illusion of progress. It seems that the content is clear, but when you need to use that information without support, it simply doesn't come. Studying correctly requires breaking this illusion. Whenever something seems too easy, it's a warning sign. Real learning happens when the brain needs to produce the answer, not just identify something familiar. If you can't explain it without looking, you haven't learned it. Another important point is to avoid studying in the same way and in the same context all the time. The brain associates learning with the environment. Varying the way of studying, the type of questions, and even the location helps create a more flexible memory that is resistant to forgetting. This principle completely changes the efficiency of studying. Instead of spending hours reinforcing a false sense of mastery, you quickly identify what you really know and what needs to be reinforced. Time begins to be used strategically. When you eliminate passive recognition and start demanding active production, the brain begins to respect studying. He understands that the information will be needed in the future and starts to protect it better. Studying correctly also requires learning to review in the right way. Most people review randomly or only when they feel like they've forgotten everything. This behavior creates cycles of rework and increases the feeling that studying never ends. The brain doesn't forget all at once. It gradually weakens connections. Smart reviews act before the information completely disappears. When you review at the right moment, the brain needs to make a moderate effort to retrieve the content. This effort strengthens memory. Reviewing correctly is not rereading everything. It's trying to remember before looking. Ask simple questions, write down what you remember, explain the content mentally. Only then check the material. This process activates the most powerful retention mechanism that the brain possesses. Another essential point is spacing out reviews over time. Reviewing on the same day helps, but reviewing days later truly consolidates. The brain learns that the information reappears and needs to be kept accessible. This principle drastically reduces the total study time. Instead of starting from scratch before exams or assessments, you keep the knowledge active over time. Confidence increases because the content doesn't disappear. When revisions are done correctly, studying stops being stressful. You know you are building something solid. The brain starts to cooperate because it understands that effort generates stability, not chaos. To study correctly, it is essential to structure study sessions that respect the functioning of the brain. Many people believe that the longer they study without stopping, the better. But the brain does not function well under prolonged continuous effort. After a certain amount of time, attention wanes and learning becomes superficial. Effective sessions start with a clear objective. Don't study everything, but study something specific. A concept, a theme, a small set of exercises. When the brain knows exactly what it needs to do, it focuses more easily. Another important point is to set a duration before starting. Studying without limits creates anxiety and resistance. When there is a defined time, the brain engages better because it knows there will be an end. This reduces the urge to escape the task. During the session, the focus must be total. Multitasking breaks learning. Switching between phone, tabs, and messages prevents the brain from going deep. Protecting that time is essential for the effort to be worthwhile. At the end of the session, it is essential to conclude consciously. Stop at the agreed time, quickly review what was learned, and note the next step. This creates a sense of closure and prepares the brain for the next session. With this format, studying stops being exhausting. The brain learns to focus more quickly and to disengage without exhaustion. Constancy increases, and the routine starts to sustain itself. A simple adjustment that completely changes the way the brain handles studying is learning to face difficulty in the right way. Most people interpret difficulty as a sign of incapacity. When something doesn't come easily, the urge to stop, change the subject, or seek something more comfortable arises. But from the brain's perspective, moderate difficulty is exactly what indicates real learning. When the content requires effort, the brain activates areas linked to adaptation and strengthening of connections. If everything is too easy, little is being built. Studying correctly means stopping to run away from difficulty and starting to use it as a guide. When something gets stuck, that's the point that deserves attention. Instead of jumping, you slow down. Break the problem into smaller parts, look for examples, test understanding. This process transforms frustration into progress. Another important point is to differentiate productive difficulty from total confusion. Productive difficulty is when you understand what you are trying to learn, but you need to put in effort. Total confusion is when the foundation is lacking. In this case, the adjustment is not to insist, but to take a step back and rebuild the foundation. This habit changes the emotional relationship with studying. Discomfort stops being an enemy and becomes a sign of progress. The brain learns that persisting is worth it. Over time, confidence grows. You realize that you can get through difficult times without giving up. And that sustains any study routine in the long run. When all these principles start to be applied together, studying correctly ceases to be something artificial and becomes a natural process. The brain likes clarity, predictability, and progress. When the method respects this, resistance decreases drastically. At this point, studying stops depending on constant motivation. You no longer need to convince yourself every day. The brain understands what needs to be done, how to do it, and why it works. The action becomes automatic. A common mistake is trying to change everything at once. Studying correctly does not require immediate perfection. It requires consistency. Adjusting one principle at a time already generates significant impact. The brain learns through repetition, not through momentary intensity. Another important point is to abandon comparison. Each person has a different pace, foundation, and context. What matters is real progress, not apparent speed. When you focus on truly learning, the result comes naturally. This stage marks the turning point. Confidence returns. The study starts to pay off. The routine stops breaking because there is now a foundation. The brain starts to associate studying with growth, not with frustration. When you learn to study correctly, everything falls into place. Time is better used. Energy is preserved. Learning accumulates. Learning to study correctly changes much more than just your routine. It changes the way you think, organize yourself, and deal with mental challenges. When the right method falls into place, the brain stops fighting against studying and starts collaborating with it. The effort starts to yield results. The time invested starts to pay off. Most people have never failed due to a lack of ability. Failed by repeating the wrong methods for too long. When you correct the foundation, everything transforms. Discipline becomes lighter. The focus lasts longer. The learning accumulates instead of disappearing. Studying correctly does not mean studying all day long. It means studying with intention, intelligent effort, and respect for the functioning of the brain. It means knowing when to move forward, when to review, and when to adjust. This understanding creates stability. And stability sustains any routine in the long run. Over time, studying stops being an emotional burden. You start to trust the process. You know that, even when something is difficult, there is a clear path to learning. This confidence changes the relationship with tests, projects, and larger goals. If this video helped you see studying in a different light, subscribe to the channel now. Here you learn how to study for real, using cognitive science, learning psychology, and methods that work beyond theory. Remember this. It's not a lack of discipline that breaks your routine. It's studying incorrectly for too long. When you learn to study correctly, the routine stops falling apart because now it has a foundation. And when the foundation is solid, growth ceases to be unstable and becomes inevitable.